Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's January 15, 2024, and today we are hailing Elliott Prasse-Freeman, academic and author of the new book published by Stanford University Press, titled Rights Refused, Grassroots, Activism and State Violence in Myanmar. Hello, Elliott, and congratulations on your book.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be back with you.
Well, thank you for neither resisting nor refusing your compulsion to accept this interview. I know you've already been on the podcast a couple of times, but those are in group discussions, and many listeners might be familiar with your work. But today's the first time that Myanmar Musings can get down to brass tacks on the sort of main research project for your early scholarly career. I guess I thought we could start by asking first, now we have this opportunity, about how you ended up caring so deeply for the people of Burma and how you ended up doing your PhD on Myanmar.
Yeah, thank you for giving me an opportunity to kind of set the stage because it's not particularly obvious how I ended up being so involved with Burma for the last 20 years. The easy or the quick answer is that I knew a lot of the things I didn't want to do coming out of undergraduate. I didn't want to be a doctor or a banker or a consultant, heaven forbid, the other things that my university set people up to do. I wanted to work in poverty alleviation and development work, and my mother had worked in northern Thailand. So I was able to connect with some of her contacts. And at that point, I learned about Myanmar, a place that I didn't know very much about. And I started to research the country and wrote my undergraduate thesis on ethnic conflict, although it was a very poor piece of scholarship, and I'm glad it doesn't exist on the internet for people to track down. But it was a start, and I moved to Yangon in 2004 and hustled my way into a job at the UN, which at that time, and maybe still does, the UN was so ineffectual vis-a-vis the regime that they couldn't get me a visa. So I had to work teaching kindergarten at one of the international schools during the weekend, so I could work for the UN during the week. And I'm not sure which one was more edifying, to be honest. Although I did get a taste of development sector and was intrigued by doing more professional work in that domain. However, doing so in Myanmar at that time, this is 2004-05, wasn't the most conducive to learning. And so I left the country, moved to Bangkok, and continued to work for similar organizations. But I never really moved completely away from Myanmar. In 2008, Cyclone Nargis happened. I still had an active visa, and I called my old boss at UNDP, and he said, well, we would prefer real experts, but they're not letting those in, so I guess you'll do. And so I flew back in and worked with them again. And in my work in Thailand, I was working with Myanmar migrants, trying to mainstream informal education into the formal education program in Thailand and getting so refugees and migrants to school. So I persisted in, through luck more so than anything else, getting to work on Myanmar issues. And then, as one does, I became pretty disillusioned with development work, both through its presuppositions of how poverty would be alleviated and justice would be delivered, and also just through the sort of logistical and pretty venal way that the sector functions. And at the same time, I also had been reading a lot about Myanmar and felt like, the things I had read didn't quite reflect the reality that I had lived. And I thought, well, I might throw my hat into the ring and see if I can come up with something that illuminates some of the, phenomena on the ground that I had experienced there. And so I pivoted into academic work with the kind of advantage of having done something else first. So I at least know that, as I like to say, it beats the heck out of real work whenever it's tempting to get disillusioned with academia too.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a great overview, and now we'll get into the book a bit. I think you've talked about this kind of practical introduction, or rather an introduction in practice, getting you onto academia, and I think Rights Refused is a deeply theoretical book. It might not seem that you would have written that based on your early beginnings, but it really is, and a lot of your work is. It may challenge, some readers who would otherwise be quite engaged in the subject matter. There's theoretical engagement with the social sciences on basically every page. How did you transform your thesis, which was a work of dense political anthropology, into this book, which is for a slightly wider audience? And on that, who do you envision this book is for?
I don't think I just had one in mind. Although, one wants to write it with some of the different interlocutors with whom I'm working, whether in the theoretically informed social sciences and humanities or the Burmese studies scholars who I'm learning from and sparring with, and then also the people with whom I spent a lot of time in Myanmar. And of course, it's difficult to do justice to all three of those particular audiences at once. And I will be the first to acknowledge that it probably fails to find a sort of general reader. But what I hope it does, or when it works well, if it works well in a few spots, let's say, it tries to shift scales and scales of analysis as much as sort of like spatial scales. And what I mean by that is that I want to take an ethnographic moment or engagement. And by that I mean describing the place and space and encounter that the people who I was lucky enough to conduct participant observation with, the things that they were doing, and then show how their engagement played out and had ramifications on a bunch of different domains, and then try to draw conclusions about why we might think about that in more general terms. And so the sort of anthropologist's silly parlor trick is to take things that seem really strange and make them seem a little bit more normal, more like what perhaps your general social science reader might think. And in so doing, take things that your reader thinks are normal and make them pretty strange. And so what I wanted to do is take this place that at first glance seems rather different. There are an authoritarian state, and there are people resisting it and refusing its presumptions in interesting ways, up to and including esoteric cursing rituals and plow protests. And so trying to take and describe in a fair amount of detail how those engagements play out, but then also use that to generate kind of empirical political theory that then could be used in other places. And sometimes it might be a bridge too far in the sense that going from that limited engagement to the sort of grand theoretical conceptual purview or conclusion might seem a little bit unwarranted, or you might as a reader just say, okay, that doesn't really work for me. But at least I wanted to give people at the very least that the story that shows rather than tells the life of what it's like to be an activist, and as a result through their work, what it's like to be a person struggling in the margins of a pretty neglectful and brutal governance regime in Myanmar. So if you don't like the theoretical conclusions, you can kind of leave that and draw your own. And that, I think, is what I think that's the goal for ethnographic writing, is that you give people enough of the life and perspective of the people who you're lucky enough to work with that they can draw their own conclusions. And I try to be pretty clear that the conclusions that I draw are mine. And I don't mean that in a proprietary sense. I mean that in the sense of like they're my mistakes. And you are the material is there for you to think otherwise with it.
Yeah, terrific. And the book does go at a bracing clip. And like, it is not a PhD dissertation format, so you don't have to spend 20 pages talking about your methodology, etc., etc. But you did mention participant observation there, and you revised this book after the 2021 coup, but the in-person fieldwork where you generated your data from took place in the years prior. And I thought, in particular, you refer often throughout the book to the Leopard Down protests and their afterlife in a few of your arguments. I thought maybe that would be a good way to pose the question, to ask you to perhaps give us an introduction to those events, your involvement in them and their margins, and your research collaborators in Burma, the people that you are writing about.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the tricky parts about writing the book was figuring out when it was finished. And in some senses, the coup both created an obvious endpoint because it put the sort of final nails in the coffin of the much lauded but now condemned transition, as it were. But it also, of course, the revolution continues to it continues to continue. Uh, the reason why I mention that is that the book has allowed me to continue to learn about the people who I wrote about. And one of the funny things about a book that I realized once I finished it is that it never really is finished. And that is actually a sort of weird paradox, but it's also a blessing in that I get to continue to learn more about it, and I get to watch and continue to be in contact with the people who are the main characters and protagonists as they deal with the current moment and how they make sense out of, let's say, the Anya revolution that's going on in those areas of Lebanon. And so the one of the purposes or one of the objectives of the book was to take the materials that I was working with during that transitional period and the lives of the activists that I was participating in and observing were could illuminate what was going on in the anti-coup uprising. And I think one of the things I've continued to think about since then, and which isn't, really in the book because I wasn't, looking at the Anya uprising in particular, was why did these people who were in areas around Lebanon, and Sagaing and Magway and Mandalay regions who hadn't traditionally been involved in kind of like national scale politics, why were they so involved in this uprising? And one of the answers that Godot, who's one of the main interlocutors in the book, gave me was he said, well, they learned how to do these kind of protests during the transition era. They learned how to be a part of the revolution from participating in the Dundon Daipwe, the plow protests, which constitute a large part of the book and certainly what was going on in Lebanon. And so you had these very diffuse grassroots movements that use these activists as sort of, in some senses, patrons, in some senses, defenders, in some senses, trainers, in some senses, cover for what they would have done anyway. And they were able to build movements, some of which were successful, but many more, unfortunately, were unsuccessful because they were dealing with a transition that didn't care much for their particular political economic demands, but it strengthened them in a sense that they then, when the context changed, they were able to mobilize themselves in ways that perhaps was maybe unthinkable, before they had this opportunity. And I don't want to suggest that the activists who I focused on here were completely responsible for this mass and diffuse uprising. That, of course, would be would be silly. But I do want to, in the book, lay down some of the repertoires of contention, some of the modes of refusing the sort of presumptions of power that existed in Myanmar, even during that transitional period, that then are pretty explicitly drawn upon, whether this be the three-fingered salute, which I first observed in 2015 in a Dagon courtroom, to the Jainza Daipwe, these cursing rituals that were used a lot and continue to be used a lot even to this day, which were popularized in Lebanon, amongst other places where the activists with whom I was working were doing what they did, can provide a little bit of insight into what's going on today. With the idea that otherwise this book would have been not anthropology but history, and so I needed to update it to respond to this, pretty impressive world historical revolution that's going on today.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, you do focus much of the book on a small group of activists that you worked with and the context that they live in, which is sort of, if there is one, the emotional foundation of the book. This overall political context and what it does to people and what people do because of it. So let's begin with that political context that you develop it early in the book, and it develops the rest of the analysis that follows. You say that Myanmar's post-colonial governance is not only authoritarian and neoliberal, but it is one of blunt biopolitics. This is a new term. So, for some people who haven't read Foucault, what makes any politics bio and what makes biopolitics blunt in Burma?
Great. Yeah, thank you for giving me a chance to outline what is a pretty painful neologism, but bear with me as I describe it. So I build off of Partha Chatterjee, who's a political theorist and anthropologist, who started off with a kind of distinction that he made between what was called civil society, where we kind of the presupposed liberal public sphere in which one person, one vote is taken, one person who has one vote is kind of taken as the object of governance. And he observed that in the colonial settings, people were never regulated that way. They were seen as members of population groups rather than mattering as individuals. And as a result, he said, well, if kind of classic sovereign power takes an individual as its kind of object of governance, Foucault described biopolitics as taking the population, these population groups of individuals, rather than individuals themselves as the object. And if, because of the legacies of the colonial period, you have people who are taken not as individuals, but as parts of groups as the object of governance, then perhaps all politics in the post-colony is biopolitics. Okay, so that's an interesting distinction, and we can probably observe to a certain extent that partially playing out in a place like Myanmar, where individual rights bearing subjects are very hard to identify. And if one can actually mobilize something that approximates a right, it feels more like a privilege than it does something that anyone could access as a sort of unmarked third person generalized citizen. And that's something I come back to at the end of the book. So does that then mean that all politics is biopolitics? Well, for Foucault, biopolitics was a form of governance that, through taking the population as its object, the sort of flourishing or the success of the politics, the governance regime, tended to want to promote and defend the population group. And you see this in sort of the way that populations their births are known, and their death rates are understood. Different endemic diseases are attacked from public health perspectives, so that you can have this flourishing population that does more good things for themselves and hence for the broader regime of governance. But in Myanmar, I didn't observe those particular things. And so on one hand, I was responding to a part of the Myanmar studies literature that I think tended to presuppose too much biopolitics, whether this being people who say, the regime abuses its own citizens and or it doesn't help them thrive, I think presupposes that they would be doing that in the first place. Second, people would often transpose certain analytical frameworks that had come from other post-colonial states. So, colonies, post-colonial entities had regulated subjects through particular apparatuses, such as, made famously by Benedict Anderson, the map, the census, and the museum, these knowledge structures that allowed certain subpopulations to be known and hence better regulated. And so you hear this a lot with what I call elsewhere the reification thesis in Burma studies, the idea that ethnicity was reified through a colonial census and hence hierarchicized and clearly delineated, so that the Bama and the Chin, the Kachin, et cetera, all are these known objects of governance, and you can ascribe someone's ethnicity just by looking at them. But by spending time on the ground in Myanmar, I didn't see that particularly well reflected either. Ethnicity is something that, of course, is very important, but it's also very muddy, and sort of the stuff that Leach was writing about a long time ago, I think still adheres in Myanmar, where people can be pretty flexible about their own identification. And the categorization project itself, Balumyole, what Lumyo are you, has been kind of overwritten by different groups on the ground. So you could say you are Bottabata Lumyo, you are Buddhist Lumyo. Some people will say that's incorrect, but the fact that others are doing it on the ground suggests that the governance regime hasn't monopolized the ability to decide on categories themselves. So I'm trying to synthesize between two positions here. On one hand, the regime and the apparatus of control definitely takes not an individual, but a sort of population group as its object of governance. But as opposed to the classic one that Foucault was describing in Western Europe, it looks a lot different in the post-colony. And so I'm trying to mobilize a sort of post-colonial biopolitics, a study of the differences that can inhere in the refractions of sort of classic analytical paradigms, but also governance regimes that, the legacy of the British colonial era in Myanmar is not exactly the same as the legacy in India, because they're quite different projects. There's similarities, of course, but they were regulated with different intensities and different objectives. And then the post-colonial state in Myanmar didn't seem to care as much about knowing or promoting the population, but rather governing through violence. So that's the sort of third component of blunt biopolitics. And we think about violence as being exceptional to biopolitics, but I wanted to kind of bring it into the frame by looking at the productive nature of violence, the way that it constructs particular population groups more so than just eradicate them. And this became clearest to me when I was researching the Rohingya population. And this kind of leads into my second book project that I'm working on today, in which many people who are consider themselves Rohingya, who are Rohingya, didn't actually necessarily identify with that term until they became an object of eradication under it. So there's a sort of interesting paradox in which mass violence creates the very mass that it is trying to eradicate. And so I tried to put those elements together and offer up a sort of paradigm, a new conceptual way of thinking about post-colonial governance. And it's quite possible that it won't work for many people. And that's fine. I mean, I think one of the challenges of writing a book is to understand it as a provocation that maybe you won't even agree with when you're done with it. And I hope I remain in fidelity to that particular perspective as I continue talking about this book in the future.
Yeah, well, certainly one part of that that nobody will argue with is the use of violence by people in power in Burma. And you write extensively about these interlocutors, research collaborators, Burmese activists, either resisting or refusing this political regime. Could you maybe select an example to illustrate the difference between the two? How does refusal work, and does it problematize or develop existing understandings of resistance? Because resistance theory is often talked about, but not so much refusal, in my experience.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that the book tries to do is make a mild intervention against or with resistance theory, which I think tends to presuppose two things. It tends to presuppose a pretty legible resisting subject who knows who he or she is, who knows who he or she his or her comrades are, and can then mobilize them pretty quickly when the time is right. And so think of chapter 8 of Domination and the Arts Resistance called Anthropology. This is James Scott's one of his influential books, where he talks about the wildfire element to many peasant uprisings, in which he says this demonstrates that this sort of hidden transcript that exists throughout peasant societies is already known by everyone, and hence when the political opportunity structure changes, people are ready to mobilize. And the reason why I don't take that necessarily on its face is because of how confusing any field of power is, and how so much of these activists' work is trying to realign different versions of common sense, which could be called hegemony, using a sort of different description. Things that you take for granted without thinking about need to be resignified to be seen as potentially political objects rather than just the way things are. And much of the work that these activists were doing wasn't of the sort of directly contesting sovereign power, but was trying to mobilize and educate and convince people to see their conditions otherwise. And so that's kind of like one intervention. And the other intervention, if we can take a sort of schematic, a spatial schematic, that's a sort of horizontal challenge. A sort of vertical challenge is their interaction with the state. And I think one of the things that much of resistance theory presupposes or presumes is that the state is a pretty legible object of resistance. And when you go do your activities, you can meet it and have this contestation that has this really interesting, but very kind of like clear and distinct contestation in which you as the resistor will be kind of defined in this moment of sovereign contestation. And one of the things that I found was that it's really, really difficult for the state to sometimes even be identified in a place like Myanmar. And that was one of the first reasons why I started to get interested in writing about the place, is that the descriptions of the country as a totalitarianism or as a sort of a place where the state tried to control everything didn't really describe what I observed. I often found the state to be maddeningly absent. And so when people use the language of everyday Burmese people evade the state. I don't condemn that language. I've used it myself, but I think that it risks misdescribing the whole situation because you tend to evade that which pursues you. And this state doesn't do a whole lot of pursuing. It doesn't do a lot of surveilling. It doesn't do much enrolling people into projects. It's often there to steal and to extract and to do ridiculous things, but its form of governance is often in neglect. And so what these activists had to do was often presence the state to get it to actually come into to get it to actually materialize rather. And then of course they would need to, and this is another part of I think of refusal, they would need to then disappear, otherwise they would become annihilated by its sort of excessive force. So there's a sort of cat and mouse game there. And I think one of the things that I didn't probably write enough about in the book, but where my head's at now, is how this form of refusal also kind of refuses being like nailed down about a particular politics. So horizontally, the sort of politics that these activists displayed is quite legible. It's a sort of modes of justice seeking through solidarity over material struggles and justice being denied to workers, poor people, and peasants. And that's something that's really consistent across the many different activists I work with. But if you try to get them to describe what kind of politics theirs is, are they communists? Are they anarchists? Are they social democrats? Are they et cetera, et cetera? They often will refuse that particular categorization. And I find that to be quite interesting because it suggests their understanding, implicit or otherwise, that politics in Burma kind of needs to remain open. It's almost like a we don't know yet, because we need to see how these struggles transform us and how they play out on the ground. And so that sort of refusal that I speak of in the book is not just refusing the sort of presuppositions of power as it exists, it's also sort of resists a stable and legible subjectivity that they can then be dismissed by perhaps or maneuvered around. They have a wonderfully kind of labile and imminent understanding of politics because of the difficulty in securing their interventions. One of the things that I continually come back to is the challenge of ever being successful as an activist in Burma. And even times, when I would say, oh, this plow protest was, you guys got your land back and because you were able to plant the seed and then it grew and then you harvest it and you sold your goods on the market. That seems like a success. And they would usually say, well, no, because the crony could come back with the military anytime. So we never really had a victory. But at the same time, because that sounds a little bit depressing, at the same time, they never really had a defeat either. You would have, and I start in the first chapter with Sansan, an activist in the Dagon courtroom that I mentioned earlier. She took off her shirt and she lit it on fire after being sentenced to 52 months in prison. And she declared, Ong Bi, Ong Bi, Ong Bi, victory has been achieved, which seems kind of a strange thing to say after being sentenced to 52 months in prison. And I think it lays down alternative trajectories of potential politics. It resignifies what, to the uninitiated or at first glance might seem like absolute sunderings or absolute failures into mere setbacks on the way to different victories. But at the same time, going back to those never being able to secure success, it means that activists are constantly anticipating failure. And so before I run the risk of going on for too long without letting you get a word in, one of the interesting things about this activist group is that they have Sinset Mapiet in their title, and that they translated that as current, as like the flow of a current, but it might better be translated as kind of continuous or perpetual, as the way that a revolution from their perspective must be. It must be constantly activated and continually trying to redress and push things forward and never become complacent.
That's a really interesting and refreshing way to think about Myanmar politics, I think. I'm sure it will be quite influential. You made me think earlier about when you were talking about people being refused to be pinned down around a subjectivity, a political subjectivity, and a label and things like that. Often a way that those things come to the surface, though, is when you talk about the hypotheticals and the future. And there's been a lot of conversation about post-revolutionary society, and I think you can really get an anchor on people through those kinds of conversations. Okay, and in that great discussion that you've just given of refusal and resistance, and earlier, there's a term, a political term, that in the English language one would perhaps expect to crop up, which is in the title of your book, but it hasn't yet. So let's have a direct question about that. The term rights. It seems, straightforward and ideologically digestible in English, even if you don't believe in them. They mean a very certain kind of thing, and not so in Myanmar, in the Burmese language. So how do these rights work in Burma? And do you think that the rights discourses, sort of foreign inflected, in Myanmar have helped or hindered people with their politics?
I first started picking up the weirdness of how people in Myanmar talked about rights when I was doing research back in 2010, so before the transition. And I found that most of the folks working on the inside in places like Yangon were talking about mobilizing for the livelihoods of people, and that they wanted to avoid, terms like human rights. And then on the outside, in places like Mesat, I was talking to people who described how not just that their organization was devoted to promoting the human rights of the people of Burma, but how they, as activists, had become kind of new people once they learned about human rights. Now, at first glance, this is perhaps maybe not so surprising. Because as Jim Scott has long counseled, people don't have the freedom to talk about something that they might actually believe because they'll get bonked on the head. But if you're on the border where you have more freedom, you can say what you believe. But I lingered on, and this is a sort of endorsement of longer term fieldwork, on the fact that people talked about their own subjective transformation when they heard about human rights. And I didn't want to, or I wanted to analyze that in the context of this broader political economy of aid and support, ideological and otherwise, that emerged in Myanmar after 1988, when people went to the border and asked for guns from the West, and the West said, no, but we'll give you human rights trainings. Now, on one hand, you could imagine people's, Burmese folks taking the funding for human rights and then using it instrumentally to do other things. But I guess what I was surprised at was a pretty, strict distinction between these folks on the border who approached human rights as a way of life. And this is something that Lynette Chua, in her book, The Politics of Love in Myanmar, also with Stanford University Press in the same series, writes about very powerfully. These people who, for whom human rights recohered them as individuals, versus those on the inside who didn't seem to have that same sort of fidelity. And then one day, when I was describing this sort of tension, this Burmese colleague of mine said, "Well, you have to understand that we don't have rights in our language." And I said, "Huh?" She said, "Well, we use a quintier, this term in Burmese, but if I said, if I translated into English, I said, you have a quintier to go to a training, we would say in English, you have a right to go to a training. But in Burmese, but in English, you would probably say you have an opportunity only." And then she continued and said, "But that's because a quintier means both right and opportunity, and they're not really differentiable." And so I perked up at this because I thought it was interesting, but given that I had read enough linguistic anthropology to be kind of concerned with making conclusions about entire cultures based on maybe the accidents of language, I wanted to use this as a potential insight, but not as a conclusion in and of itself, but asking what would it mean to have uh, a politics or a perspective on power that didn't differentiate a right from an opportunity, words that my particular language and political ontology keep quite separate. And so I began to look for how people talked about this term and developed a pretty large corpus of uses of a quintier and yapbain quint and such, so terms that had this root quint, which can be translated as right, but can also be translated as little as like permission or and creates cognates like entitlement, but also a quint of land can be as little as chance. And so you have a huge range in the root, semantic range in the root, and that in itself is quite interesting. And I think it shows that human or rights, human or otherwise, tend to be a lot more contingent on the context than they do in other places where they're more rigid. The other thing that I found looking at the ways that people tended to talk about quintier and other things is that they tended to be thought of not as arms or mothers, as inalienable possessions, things that when lost are still yours. And what I mean by that is that if you lose your arm on the way to this podcast interview, it would still be yours. You would still say, "I lost my arm," even though in a sort of material sense, it's not really yours anymore. It's in I don't know what happens to a severed arm after you lose it, but it's quite, you can imagine that it's in the dustbin. And so what's interesting is that the way that we in English, or at least in the Anglo-American political tradition, tend to talk about rights is in the same kind of register. We talk about the rights that you have, even when you don't have them, even when they're severed from you. And one of the jokes that I buried in a footnote in the book is like the political philosophers of the 1990s, the Beastie Boys, remind us that you have to fight for your right to party. And so the Beastie Boys are telling you that even when you don't have the ability to party at that particular moment, it's still your right to party. And then you have to fight for something that you don't have. So this is something that's kind of we're so used to describing things this way, fighting for our rights. We don't notice what has sometimes been called the possession paradox involved in this, that the fact that you can somehow have something that you don't have. And this affords interesting kinds of politics in particular contexts. So when you believe you have something that you don't have, you can employ this performative of invoking it and then essentially fake it till you make it. You can form it into existence. But there's also a danger in exposing yourself to political risk of invoking something that you don't have. And I think that the Myanmar tradition tends to be more aware of those particular risks, and as a result, doesn't presuppose things that don't exist. And I found a lot of linguistic evidence of people talking about rights not as inalienable possessions, that things that can be stolen and never given, and then that remain with them even if they are lost, but rather rights can be, they can be snatched, they can be carried off. Certain people can get more rights than another, and as a result, they tend to be seen as more zero sum, rather than the way that a Western liberal conception would have it, that everyone is kind of looking at rights as a public good, that, non-rival, non-excludable, like national defense or clean air. My use of it doesn't affect your use. One extra person's use of it doesn't mean there's less of it, but in a Burmese context, this there are limited numbers of rights. And I think what this does is that, as you so eloquently put it at the start, this is sort of term that we don't think of as having, as both having a fixed meaning, but also not having much reason for interrogating it. But by looking at this Burmese version, you're able to start to see the particular rights cultures that just can be distinguished from one another, in whether if they're in Myanmar or in America, where I'm from. And so the book concludes by asking, what would it be? Would it be productive? Would it be interesting? Would it be maybe liberating to take a perspective on rights that Burmese people do, rather than the ones that we do in America? And one of the things I talk about is how, on one hand, rights language is accelerating. And so we have more rights discursively than we might be able to achieve in a place like America, even as materially our lives, because of sort of neoliberal biopolitical exclusion that is occurring as the world becomes more and more unequal, we have less of an opportunity of realizing those rights. And I argue there's a particular kind of existential angst or ennui in being split between this sort of version of ourselves that has all these rights that we don't have, and then this material version of ourselves who kind of is aware that we are not living the life that we have been described. And I think a lot of revanchist white grievance politics in America emerges from a sort of problem at the level of the person, where people are being told they have these rights that they're not able to actually achieve. So on one hand, then, in terms of tactics of mobilization, it can be demobilizing to be told you don't have rights, because then you don't have ground to stand on when you make your incursions. But on the other hand, it can be quite demobilizing to be told you have rights but not be able to get them. It kind of defines the terrain of struggle, and it eliminates other alternatives. So people tend to go to a protest and demand their rights, and then when they don't get them, they go home and complain about it. Well, Burmese people know they don't have, or the activists I work with anyway, had no, they were not they had no illusion that they had these rights. And so they were constantly thinking of other ways of doing politics. And I think it made the political field much broader, and it allowed them to improvise really interesting things that I don't know occur in many other places that are so, can't quit rights, as it were.
Yeah. Look, that's fascinating, and a really, really good addition to the toolkit for people trying to understand Myanmar, thinking about rights, thinking about refusal, and also about biopolitics. And you brought it into a wider discussion there, not just about Myanmar, but about you're American and understanding the United States of America there, which leads me to think about these broader investigations. You put quite a bit of effort in to taking this book on a book tour right after publication. You went to something like a dozen universities and venues, something like that, for lectures and discussion. And I guess that your audiences there may have specialized in the study of politics, but not so much the study of Myanmar. I want to ask you, if you think back over that book tour you did, what was the best question that you got asked about the book, and why?
I had two scholars who didn't know each other in very different events ask very similar questions, and it kind of has forced me to continue to grapple with something at the heart of the book. And that was that they both said there's a sort of double refusal that occurs here. There's a refusal of the military state and its authoritarian blunt biopolitics. There's also a refusal of the easy solution in the Western liberal rights bearing paradigms that came along with the transition as well, and the sort of liberalized economy that necessarily went along with it, but then tended to leave the people they cared about less well off. So they both identified a sort of gap in the middle, a sort of like, well, what actually do these activists stand for, and what happens when you're fundamentally a subject of refusal? And I've already talked a little bit about that earlier, but it's forced me to continue to think about whether this, maybe not like an aporia, maybe not and maybe not a mistake, but rather maybe like to what extent does a life of refusal create a sort of interesting deferral of potential politics? And to what extent can one describe all activists, not just the ones in Myanmar, but maybe activists everywhere, as needing to have a sort of really interesting and paradoxical mix of radical commitment to certain versions of justice, and then at the same time, a radical openness, or sometimes called immanence, right? Or becoming to do things a different way if everyone that you're working with and in solidarity with decides on it. And so that's the sort of thing that I've been trying to think through, is there a sort of activist ontology or political subjectivity that could have more purchase beyond the Myanmar case? So that's something I'm working on now. And I don't know if I would have seen it if not for the taking the book on tour, as it were, as obnoxious as that sounds, and without having people take it seriously enough to engage the argument and think through it with me. And that was something I'm really grateful for.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I look forward to seeing where that takes you. But perhaps in more proximate terms, what's next for you? You mentioned another book. What can we look forward to?
Yeah, so ever since I turned in my dissertation in 2018, I kind of pivoted to look more at the Rohingya conflict because it's not something that I was able to address more directly in the book, although chapter 6 does talk about the Rohingya and particularly how the activists I work with interacted with Rohingya and Myanmar Muslim struggles for justice and against genocidal violence in the country. And so since then, since starting at NUS in Singapore, I've been lucky enough to be close to the places that Rohingya have been forced to flee in the last, not just since 2017, but in many decades, especially since 1978 with the Operation Nagamin, which was one of the first ethnic cleansings that have occurred or that these people have suffered since then. And I've kind of found that there hasn't been a whole lot of kind of basic ethnological work done on the Rohingya. And I'm doing an oral history project in Cox's Bazar with a group of researchers who are really, really talented. And I'm really lucky to be working with them. And we're trying to figure out kind of basic stuff that gives the Rohingya a much more human description than the mere kind of and quite purient tales of violence and suffering that most of the literature has focused on. And I don't want to dismiss the violence these people have suffered because it's a huge part of their collective memory at this point, and a huge part of what it means to be Rohingya is bearing witness to or even suffering the violence at the hand of the state. But it isn't everything. I mean, these are people, and this should be no surprise, but these are people who had highly sophisticated governance structures and had really dynamic transnational migration patterns and relations with people in India, what's now Pakistan, into Saudi Arabia. And so I want to then tell a more sophisticated story about this group, and then also then lead into the second part of the book, which would be like, well, given the deterritorialization amidst mass violence that Rohingya have experienced, what does Rohingya-ness mean? How do you live a sort of deterritorialized nationhood that is in the process of both changing as it interacts with different places? So Rohingya in Saudi Arabia might have a different perspective on their religion, on their ethnicity than one in Malaysia, for instance. And also like, what are their ideas of the future? So that's something I've been working on since 2018. But of course, with the COVID period, it was very difficult to get to Cox's Bazar and to get to Malaysia. And I have been doing a lot more of that field work in the last couple of years. I just got back from KL on Friday, in fact. So hopefully in the next year or so, I'll do some serious writing on that and maybe have another chat with you in a couple years' time.
Look forward very much to that. And thank you for your patience with all these questions and your detailed responses. The last question's always a bit of a gear shift where we ask the guest to give a recommendation of some sort to the audience. It doesn't have to be scholarly if you don't like. It can be anything. I'm guessing you do not recommend appendicitis, but maybe something else.
So I think that one of the things that is really exciting about the last 10 years, the transition period, despite everything else that was bad about it, was the fact that it allowed young scholars, Burmese and otherwise, to do some really interesting work. And I think there are going to be some fascinating publications that are going to be coming out in the next couple of years. So two quick plugs. So one of the first plug will be for two young Burmese researchers, Min Nguyen and Dihao Went Ong, have this article in the Irrawaddy that kind of suggests that the mandala polity and the concentric circles of understanding power and looking at politics in a homogeneous sense is not something that got left behind in the colonial era, but something that's still relevant, especially for Myanmar's current revolution. And this is something I thought of a lot when thinking about the struggles that are going on in Anya, where it's kind of unclear what exactly they're fighting for. But in many cases, they're not fighting for the NUG, right? They're fighting for their own understandings of freedom. And I think what this article does is it kind of brings in sort of the political anarchist tradition that I think needs to be taken seriously with as people think about the future of Myanmar. On that same theme, Stefan Huard has a book that is coming out that's actually on that same area. So if you want to understand the sort of Anya revolution, you can look at his new book, which was originally called Beyond the Village Headman, and it will be out Bergen Books in 2024. Although its title might change and to something like Calibrated Engagements. But anyway, look out for that and I think those people who are thinking with the revolution and trying to do kind of political theory through it are allowing us to understand this particular moment in ways that we might not have if we are just looking at the old ways of doing politics.
Yeah, and it might also be interesting for me and for others. There was an episode with Stefan after he finished his fieldwork, maybe 5 or 6 years ago on Myanmar Musing, so maybe before that, even 6 or 7 years ago. It might be interesting to go back and listen to that before reading what comes out after the coup. Okay, two excellent recommendations. Once again, thank you for coming on the show, taking an hour out of your day. Really appreciate it. And do recommend everybody go out and get Rights Refused. If you don't want to buy it, it probably has an exorbitant academic price tag. You might be able to access it through ProQuest databases online or any other way, Elliott.
I heard that some scoundrel uploaded it to LibGen, the site where you can get everything for free. I would have no idea who did that, but I would suggest that could be another way you could get it.
Yeah, well, maybe we don't endorse that, but there you go. Okay, great. Thanks again for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.